Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are finishing up the book of Ruth today, which doesn't seem possible, but I guess only 4 chapters, and we can do it in 4 days. So thanks for studying along with us. Hopefully, if you just jumped in on the book of Ruth, you'll continue with us, because the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are up next, and they're pretty interesting books. I'm working on them currently. So if you want the PDF outline, you can get it on our website. As always, there's a link in the description. Let's talk about the last chapter of the book of Ruth, and let's find out how the story ends, because it kind of left us on a cliffhanger in the last chapter. You remember Boaz was going to go try to talk to the relative of Naomi to figure out if he was going to be able to marry Ruth or if someone else was going to do it. So that was the cliffhanger. All right, but anyway, first of all, when did the events of this chapter take place? The events in the book of Ruth, we are told, took place during the period of the Judges, which was somewhere between the years 1450 BC and 1000 BC. It spans several hundred years. We're not exactly told where Ruth fits in there, but it was somewhere within that time period. We can't estimate it, though, based on some information we get at the end of this chapter. And that was that Ruth was, who was that guy? David. Ruth was King David's great-grandmother. Most people estimate David to be born around 1040 BC. So being his great-grandmother, Ruth's story is probably somewhere around 1100 BC. That's the estimate I'm going with. As we mentioned in the previous chapters, the map for this book is pretty simple. Ruth and Naomi move from Moab to Bethlehem at the first chapter of the book, and the rest of the story takes place in and around Bethlehem. Our characters are going to be mostly familiar except for one, who we'll talk about as our fourth character. Naomi was an Israelite woman who had become widowed when her husband died in Moab. She was the mother-in-law to Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite woman. She was also a widow. She had been married to Naomi's son, and her Naomi's son had died. Then we have Boaz. He's described as a worthy man, a man of high character. We find out in the last chapter, and then we find out in this chapter as well. He was an Israelite, and he was also a relative of Naomi's, which is quite important, as we found out in chapter 3. Our last character, the fourth one, is this I'm going to call him the first Redeemer. This man was a relative of Naomi's who was even more closely related to Naomi and Ruth than Boaz was. So now let's jump over to the outline and we'll finish off the story of Ruth. Verses 1 through 12 is our first section. Boaz meets with the first Redeemer. So Boaz went to the gate of the city to resolve the problem that came up in Ruth chapter 3. Just as a refresher, as a relative of Ruth's, he had the right and the responsibility to care for her and to marry her. However, the closer relative, this first Redeemer, had to forego that right first before Boaz had the opportunity to exercise his right. There was kind of a line of succession of how these things needed to be done. So Boaz found this closer relative. He called over 10 elders of the city of Bethlehem, and he explained the situation to them. Naomi was selling a piece of land that had belonged to her husband, her deceased husband, Elimelech. And as the closest relative, this first Redeemer had the right to purchase that land. He had the first right. However, in doing so, he would also become responsible for caring for Ruth. Now, the first Redeemer, he was interested in the land, but he wasn't particularly interested in having a new wife. And so he relinquished his right and gave permission to Boaz to redeem the land and to redeem Ruth. So the Redeemer took off his shoe and he gave it to Boaz. And we're told that this was the cultural way of showing that an agreement had been reached. And all the people who witnessed it were in favor of the agreement, and they blessed the union, the future union of Boaz and Ruth. The story of Ruth and Boaz ends in a happy way. Verses 13 through 17, Ruth and Boaz get married. So they got married and they had a son, which was a great blessing. And the women of Bethlehem praised God for taking care of Naomi and for her family after their grief in Moab. One interesting detail is that Ruth isn't said to have named the new child. In fact, the women of the neighborhood were the ones who named the child. I don't know how that worked out, but they named the child Obed. Our last section I've referred to several times. It's the genealogy of King David. You might say, well, why is this in here? Well, it's important because Ruth is one of the descendants of David, and David's really important in Israelite history. So verses 18 through 22, the genealogy of King David. Ruth was, I've said it 15 times, Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David, as I wrote down again here. David was from the tribe of Judah, and his family tree is recorded at the end of this chapter, starting from Perez. Now, Perez was the son of Judah, who was one of the sons of Jacob. Right? And Jacob's sons, his 12 sons, became the 12 tribes of Israel. In Genesis 46, we're told that Judah gave birth. Well, he didn't give birth. That can't happen. Gender matters. Sorry. Judah was the father of Perez. Perez of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nation, Nation of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, and then he was the father of Obed, who was the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. So that is the story of Ruth. It ends in a happy way, teaches us a lot of things about the providence of God, God's care for people, takes us from sorrow in the first chapter to God's blessing in the last chapter. There's tons of stuff that we can learn from this book. I had like 10 applications I was going to put down here, but this is the one that I've got for you, kind of a big picture kind of application. The story of Boaz and Ruth is similar to the story of all Christians. Ruth and Naomi were struggling and in need of help at the beginning of the book. We are struggling and in need of help and are separated from God because of our sins. We're destitute like Ruth and Naomi were at the beginning. Ruth needed a redeemer. We needed a redeemer. And a redeemer came from Bethlehem to save Ruth. And if you know the story of the New Testament, where does the redeemer come from who saves us? It comes from Bethlehem. Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Right? So there's all these parallels. There's even more parallels if you go look them up, but I've got limited space and time. So Ruth's story parallels ours in a lot of ways. And thank God for our redeemer. Redeeming someone is to buy them back, to save them. And that's what Jesus does for us. So that's the book of Ruth. Thanks for joining me. Lord willing, tomorrow we will start the book of 1 Samuel. We'll have a new outline, a new design. I need to get to work on that, and I'll talk to you guys later.